all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
Welcome to Left to Black, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are thrilled today to be joined by Thulani Davis, a professor and a Nellie Y. McKay Fellow in the Afro-American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of many, many books, the most well-known being My Confederate Kinfolk, 21st Century Freed Woman Discovers Her Roots, which was published in 2006. At least two novels, Makers of Saints, which was published in 1996, and 1959, which was published in 1992. She has also published collections of poetry, Playing the Changes, which was published in 1985, and All the Renegade Ghosts Rise, which was published in 1978. And I could go on here, but there's so many more things, right? Including screenwriting credits. She was a screenwriter for the film Paid in Full, which dropped in 2002. And she also won a Grammy for her liner notes for The Queen of Soul, the box set collection of Aretha Franklin, which dropped back in 1992 and was my Bible when I was writing my dissertation so many years ago. She is joining us here today to talk about her book, The Emancipation Circuit, Black Activism Forging, a Culture of Freedom, which was published by our friends, obviously, at Duke University Press. The great Robin D.G. Kelley writes of Emancipation Circuit. In this spectacular book, Thulani Davis presents a framework for not only rewriting the Civil War and Reconstruction, but for understanding the entire history of the Black freedom movement extending into the 20th century. As groundbreaking as W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, the Emancipation Circuit is a masterpiece. And continuing on with that glowing praise, my colleague here at Duke University, Livonia Glemp, author of The Woman's Fight, The Civil War's Battles for Home, Freedom, and Nation Rights. In this extraordinary work of scholarship, Thulani Davis gives us something we have not had before, a new and beautifully written, deeply researched account of grassroots organizing by formerly enslaved people in the postbellum South and their capacious sense of the political. Filled with brilliant insights, this compelling account of the activist networks and political formations through which Black people built the, quote, first mass Black movement in the U.S. deserves a prominent place in every class and every discussion for the work Black people did to become free and claim the rights of citizenship. How are you doing today, Professor Davis?
I'm okay. I had a hard time recovering from those blurbs. I love both those people and their work. So, yeah.
So I want to start, before we delve into the book, to talk a little bit about your career arc. I first read you, as I read so many great people in those days, in the Village Voice in the 1980s, where I knew of you as a journalist writing at some place in the Village Voice. And that's back in the days that, if there was a Thulani Davis piece dropping, a Lisa Jones piece dropping, and God bless him, rest in peace, a Greg Tate piece was dropping, right? You had to pick up your free copy of The Voice, right? But you're also, at the time, working on a libretto, Anthony Davis's opera of Malcolm X. I mean, there's so many things that you were doing up to this point in your career. And it makes me wonder what then made you choose to become an academic.
The short version of that is 9/11. All the newspapers got rid of everybody after 9/11 because all the furniture ads were gone because nobody was buying furniture. At The Voice, I was there on my second tour of duty, and they fired 17 of us in one afternoon. I think I was number 2. And I wanted to have a job that had more permanency. I did look for journalism jobs for months or maybe a year, I can't remember. And I had grad school credits because I had been trying to get a PhD in the 70s at Penn in literature. I got sick, wound up in the hospital, and lost my fellowship. And I just right then I went, I think I want to switch to history. I didn't do so immediately, but I realized everything I was writing about had to do with history, and that I was like pretty much a history nut. And I was reading Mark Twain for the 18th time, and God bless him. I love Melville and all those people, but I thought no one taught Black literature in the 70s in colleges. I certainly never had it in the 60s. And I thought I really could try to specialize in what I was interested in, which was what happened to African Americans in this country. And so it took me a while, but I went back to school in middle age, and I'm advocating for that, because the one advantage I had by then was I could write on deadline, and I was really organized, and I had no social life. So I was like, I can do this.
This book feels really personal to me. Talk a little bit about your journey to writing the Emancipation Circuit.
Oh, I grew up a couple of miles from Fort Monroe, where 1619 happened, and where the first contrabands, fugitives from slavery, ran during the Civil War. I went to school with a bunch of kids whose last name was the same as the name of the people who owned my family, but I didn't know it then. I didn't know what contrabands were. But I grew up in a community that was in struggle, and I was empowered early on by walking down the main street of my town with everybody I knew, and watching the people stare at us, protesting segregation. So there's kind of Virginians love history, as we can tell by the Confederate statues, but there's a link between the civil rights movement, in my experience, and coming to learn the contraband history. My great-grandfather was a contraband and got his family out of whatever farm they were on, 10 of them, and went to Fort Monroe and got a job handing out blankets and food. And yet I sort of didn't know much about that. But when I started really studying the work done in the 80s by all these wonderful scholars, I noticed they kept mentioning the same places all the time. And I was like, those places are connected because people had relatives in them. And I knew this from the early days of the civil rights movement, because when the sit-in happened in Greensboro, our phone rang, and my dad's cousin, who taught in North Carolina at North Carolina State, called, and it was in Hampton 2 weeks later. So I knew that even people who were fugitives, they, to the extent they knew where any family members were or people they knew who had been sold, some consolidation and meeting new people happened when they all took shelter around these Union forts. And I said, they must have done what we did in the 20th century and go from one county to another. So I went looking at where all the activists went to educate freed people about their rights. And that sort of set me on that way.
There's a penchant among some of our younger colleagues to really dismiss the ability to organize and the ability to resist amongst folks, particularly during the civil rights generation. That all these kind of gestures and metaphors, we're now not our parents' generation, that whole stuff. Ironically, you begin the book, quoting from Martin Luther King, writing himself, trying to make some sort of connection between this mass social movement of the 1960s as recovering disparate attempts at resistance that occurred, in the antebellum and postbellum period. And that's where you make your first intervention. You're like, that's not the case, right? if we talk about emancipation circuits, what we're talking about were broad-based social movements that existed well before, right, we had any sense of them. And in fact, the very reason why Martin Luther King and SNCC and SALC could organize in the 1960s was because of these dynamics that had emerged so many years before. So talk a little bit about, what exactly these emancipation circuits were.
Okay, well, first, I just want to say this is where the role of historians comes in. They were not taught anything in school about our history. Okay, they're innocent, except for Lerone Bennett. They were innocent of our past. And the same way I describe myself growing up, being empowered by community, but not knowing the history. And I understand that he's saying that urge to rebel is there, but when I wrote Confederate Kinfolk, I thought they had wiped out the knowledge about how to organize and do things like voter registration in Reconstruction, because I knew already they had targeted voter registrars. They targeted people who registered Black people to vote. And I'm sure they're going to get to it again. But I thought it might have wiped out the memory, that it wasn't passed on. But the organizing skills, I am sure, were. And I tell my students all the time, the vast majority of that 4 million could not read and write, but they could organize across 5 counties in their state. And I do stress that they went on horseback or by boat and did it in person. There is a value to knowing who you can trust in the room, et cetera. But they also took all comers, so they were listening to women, which wouldn't happen later necessarily in the same way. So I think there is a palimpsest, a layering of knowledge. So that knowledge might mostly be in the church in one town, but you know how highly organized Black churches are. It may be that the Pentecostals sent women out on the road to form study groups to spread what is now COGIC, but Church of God in Christ. But those were the tools that I believe are still in communities.
It's funny because when one reads the title of your book, it has such a contemporary feel about it. Like you could be talking about the internet, like that you could be talking about Twitter, but you're not talking about, digital circuits in this case, right? You're talking about more analog circuits. And I was struck by the idea, and you're right, a heritable oral regime of knowledge, oral traditions, right? Stuff that's passed on person to person, kin to kin. You mentioned people riding on horses. When you look back at what these generations of folks were able to achieve, essentially using word of mouth in oral culture, right? There were a few folks who could read, right? There were a few intellectuals. Obviously, there were preachers, right, who were seen as intellectuals in many contexts. What do you think gets lost in this contemporary moment as we're still dealing with these kinds of issues, and we don't see that same kind of connectivity that seems so organic to these formations that you talked about centuries ago?
Okay, and in answering that, I'm going to answer your question about what is the circuit. The routes of the circuit are the routes that they shipped the products that we were producing on. And there were, in Virginia and North Carolina, something near 2,000 watermen who enslaved people who worked the rivers, taking stuff back and forth all the time on their own, unpoliced. There were connections that people understood they had to other plantations where their family might have been sold. But the main pit stops on that circuit are places where lumber or rice or cotton was passing through to get to the Atlantic, to go wherever it goes, to New England or to England or France or whatever. So people really, we live in a culture where if you were a Black child coming to the door of someone looking for your brother and sister and you have the wrong house, only your skin color matters. But in a lot of contexts where, like the industries that we worked in, Black people are invisible. So the people were not necessarily aware that these Black people who were loading things knew the routes.
Yeah.
They knew where the stuff was going, where it came from, and they, if they rode the trains or the boats to load and unload, they knew people. So I started trying to look at the ground level like that. So the connective tissue is, in a way, the commerce in the South. I don't know if we have that anymore, except for the sake of unions. Unions have those kind of connections where they might have a statewide network, a union of teachers or whatever. But the geography is quite literal and physical in that people who couldn't read and write were very anxious to know routes to get away from there. They were interested in routes to get information. So if papers were dropped off on the train route, people made sure they availed themselves of getting reliable information, that kind of thing. So today it's sort of like really knowing your way around the internet. But I don't know, because you're not looking a person in the eye, I'm not sure the value of the connections with people you have never gone to elementary school with or whatever. Yeah.
I heard in an interview you talked about, the folks using terms like we, and we wasn't necessarily Black people holistically, but Black people in terms of folks that you belong to these different organizations to, you belong to these different churches to, and it was important because you could build those elements of trust in what was a very localized culture, right? That's the other thing that strikes me about this book. It pays careful attention to the ideas of one, local knowledge, but local organizing, right? That there's no national agenda, right? In the same way that we often talk about national agendas now, in those days, everything was local.
They are going to try to do that at the end of the 19th century. But I think the thing that was powerful to me was this one thing I found from a camp in Mississippi where they wrote a letter saying, "We the colored people." Yeah. And I was just like, okay, they actually have learned from landing in a spot where there's 10,000 fugitives from slavery trying to take shelter, that there's a very substantial we that has the same kinds of knowledge, the same experience, the same trauma, and the same 25 things we need as displaced people. That was a bond in itself, to be in a camp, sleeping on muddy ground, needing food, clothing, and something that would give you some actual money every week, so you could purchase certain things. And so it was exciting to me to try to visualize. I know Northern Black abolitionists had a sense of we, but for just hundreds of thousands of people to suddenly go, oh, there's a lot of us. There's so much power that stems from there. And also an idea that if I go to the next town and talk about these things I've been through, they're going to understand. I'm not going to have to explain. And then I'm going to say, you got to register to vote. So I believe the civil rights workers who had grown up in the North probably even, they had more of an adjustment maybe to sleeping on people's floors and things like that. God bless all of them. They were my heroes. But I feel like the Southern organizers probably taught the activists who came from the North a lot about Black culture that they didn't really have a chance to enjoy in the North, because there was only one church in Brooklyn, one in Manhattan, that kind of thing. Their numbers were so small. So most of their letters say it was like a devastatingly moving experience. And I enjoyed it vicariously. It's just, wow, you talk about slavery all your life and then you go see it. And
yeah.
So.
You're writing obviously in the postbellum period, but I wonder how much this knowledge of on the ground knowledge of these networks, these circuits, was informed by the experience of folks during the antebellum period, and particularly Maroons. How much did Maroon culture, you think, influence, this sense of building these kind of hiding in plain sight, if you will?
Oh, it seems to me from what I've read that Maroon communities were very well known. And in Virginia, around the Dismal Swamp, where Nat Turner was trying to get to, some of the former enslaved people interviews talk about going and leaving food at the edge of the swamp,
right?
Because they knew people were there, even if they didn't know the people who were there exactly. They knew there was a community in there. So I just recently read about in Texas, they found 500 all Black towns or communities, and a great number of them. This is part of my last conversation with Greg Tate. I told him a great number of them were in swamps in eastern Texas. And I'm just like, they were very conscious of self-defense in building all Black communities. It's one of the reasons they wanted to build them, but also in picking environments for them. Same in South Carolina. The Black communities were built in a circle. The Geechee communities, children could play in the middle,
right,
in the grass between all the houses, and everybody could see in every direction. And it may be African and African retention, but I think it's a response to the tremendous violence people faced as freed people.
You described one of the things that's significant about your book, Emancipation Circuits, and the intervention that it makes, is that it's one of the first studies to really pay attention to these geographical circuits. And much of the work that's done, in the immediately after Emancipation period, Reconstruction period, right, that doesn't really focus on these particular kind of networks. I've kind of asked this before, but what drew you to really focusing on these networks as opposed to doing other forms of scholarship around Reconstruction? And what kind of connection do you really see to these networks as it developed, in the 1870s and going forward, to what we're seeing now in terms of this desire of Black people to continue desire to be in touch with each other and connected with each other?
Okay, I think it's a long-term investment in safety. Most of the books on Reconstruction are about politics. And I'm a politics junkie. I love politics, but it is boring to read about 19th century politics, that particular set of politics, because it's not changing. It was. There are really important books still coming out about those same politics. A recent book on the 13th, 14th, and 15th is just a wonderful work. I teach it to my students. But their focus has changed such that they're saying, this is something Black struggle gave American history, these amendments. And that's how I teach it now. And I hadn't myself looked at it quite that way until I got into the grassroots, ground level idea of, one, how knowledgeable human beings were about the wide array of rights that they needed to be able to practice. They knew they needed to be able to get a doctor, but they also knew that there should be a public school system. So some of those they solved privately by pooling their money so they could put a doctor on account. And the other they did through politics. They already knew going to prison was bad enough. Being beat in prison would be something they would expect to happen, but they knew it was inhumane. So they used politics to fight that. But I think the culture itself was doing another job, which was processing trauma and sustaining people through really having to stick together to form a little bank to make sure somebody will have food when they get sick and can't work. That all the beginnings of all the unions Black people formed really come out of these collective banks of small groups of people who live near each other. Mm-hmm. And they also had this broad idea of the common good for the country. So their notion was the country couldn't practice democracy unless everybody had a good education. They needed not just to read and write, but they needed to learn all those things. We're still struggling to make a part of everyday life. And they definitely didn't want their children to be handicapped in the ways they were by the slave system. So it's a broad view, but I tell my students, if you go to talk to a displaced population in Syria or pick your place, and we never see those people, we don't know anything about what's happening to them. But I said, these people have the same list of what they need. And that includes political rights, the right to free speech, the right to open a press, to print information you need, and also what you have to say, somewhere to express the collective voice. But in those small communities, there are communities in Arkansas, according to one of the books I read, where people thought they had been saved from the violence of Reconstruction because they were up in a Pentecostal church. And in the Pentecostal church, they were practicing speaking in tongues, but also letting local musicians blues players come in there and play guitar and sing. And to me, the exact practice of how Black people do church that horrified some of the Union soldiers that saw them is what kept people alive spiritually. And lastly, one of their first requirements of the state that they lived in were hospitals for the mentally ill. And that was my clue. One of the first ones ever made is still operating in Virginia under a different name, but it was assigned to me that the communities knew there were people in the community so damaged by slavery that they weren't coherent to the community, and that it wasn't a shame, it wasn't something to be shunned, but something that required medical assistance. And for me, people asking for that in 1868,
it's extraordinary. Yeah. You mentioned, the written word, the right to publish. And we talk a great deal, in the culture about Nat Turner, right? The famous Black mystic. I don't think we pay nearly enough attention to a figure like David Walker and his pamphlet, The Appeal, right? And I think there's a way, in which it's absolutely astounding that he was able to create this pamphlet, to be able to circulate it, to the extent that anybody would be talking about it so many years later. But it also speaks to the fact that you argue that, Black political thought, which we typically think about in terms of coming from the learned classes, right? From Black philosophers, from Black political theorists, right? That's how we think about Black political theory in 2023. But you argue that it's along these circuits that
Yeah,
Black political thought, initially emerges and gets, transferred from one space to another, from one generation to another generation.
yeah, and I think those people would be shocked if you said to them, "That's radical." But the most radical thought, not to mention some of the best ideas about how to organize, come from the ground up.
Yeah, right.
And there's they're less limited by what someone might say are the political realities. They're like, we need what we need. Or there are certain things that have never been fixed. And so it is, it's important to listen to the least of these, the people who have the least to lose in the room. It's important. And I think because there were millions of people with that outlook, that we have framed the practice, the ongoing practice, reform, innovation of democracy in this country, because aside from the revolution and the Civil War, we are the next biggest movement and about what is the country about. And that was not you and me, but our ancestors back in during the Civil War and in the days and years after. And I think one of the great things is that there's some sort of mental notepad about what didn't get done.
Mm-hmm.
And those things are still of value. The police violence that and also the gun violence that we confront every day and hear about every day, that culture, the gun culture probably started in Jamestown, but that culture is very much the same thing. Freed people were confronting, and initially as a completely unarmed population of 4 million. Yeah, so I feel like in studying this, my students are somewhat surprised because when you're young, everything only happened in your lifetime. I think they're really shocked by people just walking down the street. Oh, you didn't step off the sidewalk when a white person came by? Yeah.
What are you working on next, Professor Davis?
I am writing about itineracy, cultural itineracy in the Mississippi Valley. I'm writing about William Grant Still, Alberta Hunter, Robert Johnson, Louis Armstrong, W.C. Handy, the marvelous Mr. Harry Pace, and the fact that being in the Mississippi Valley and traveling up and down as things like the new gospel music were being invented, Aretha's mother is in Memphis, that it was the innovator and improvisers Juilliard, that you could go to Memphis and there were 3 Black theaters with shows in them, new comedy, new dance, new music, and around the corner was W.C. Handy's place. And I'm just tracking, I am actually doing the geography of that all those people traveled, but it's like Louis Armstrong learned how to read music literally on a boat going up and down the Mississippi in a band of Black guys who couldn't believe this talented 15-year-old couldn't sight read. So it's sort of like, I think an introduction into the turn of the century and how the story really went, that story about how jazz went from Storyville to Chicago. And I opened by mentioning there are 26 movies Louis Armstrong was in. Most of them are telling the story about jazz being brought by white guys to Chicago and New York, white guys who were threatened in New Orleans for being white and playing black music. And Louis was the only guy in those movies who had actually made the journey. So it's a lot more fun because I've been reading violence against black people every day for 10 years. But I'm really looking at how improvisers were influenced actually by being in those places, Arkansas and Mississippi and Tennessee, and then going to the city. When they go to the city, there's an idea that's already been worked with Black audiences, and suddenly they're going to go to Chicago and play a club, and they'll go in and say, no, I do it faster than that. It's I'm enjoying it.
Well, we're going to look forward to having you join us again when that book is published.
Oh, great. Thank you. I hope I'll see you before then.
Yes. We've been joined today by Professor Thulani Davis, who is a Nellie Y. McKay professor and Nellie Y. McKay Fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of the book, The Emancipation Circuit, Black Activism Forging a Culture of Freedom, published by Duke University Press, of which Robin D.G. Kelley writes, as groundbreaking as W. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, the Emancipation Circuit is a masterpiece. Thank you for joining us, Professor Davis.
Thank you. It was great fun.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.